Would you take out your Bibles and open them up to the book of Genesis? We are still working our way through the book of Genesis. We are still in chapter 29, which is where we left off last week. Chapter 29. We're just going to read 5 short verses together. And if you're using one of our journals, it's on page 130, down toward the bottom of the page. We're going to pick up at verse 31. Genesis chapter 29. Verse 31 through verse 36. This is what it says. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben. For she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. She conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. Again she conceived and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. Then she conceived again and bore a son and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. Last week, we saw that Jacob's treachery had come around and bitten him in the rear. You know, we talked about he that moves a stone and all this kind of stuff. And we saw that as you live a life of treachery or deception or anything like that, God will not bless it. And in fact, it will come around and bite you again someday. I was thinking about that, and it reminded me of a time when our kids were little, and we were at my parents' for like a Memorial Day picnic or something like that. And they were out playing, and they were all rather young. And there was a large garter snake sunning itself on the rocks just out behind the back door. And I saw the garter snake, and they were all scared and coming in, and they wouldn't go out there. And I said, there's really nothing to worry about. Because when we were kids, we used to go out and collect garter snakes. Anybody, did you guys do that when you were kids? Absolutely. We'd collect them. And one time it was terrible because I had an uncle who was like deathly afraid of snakes, and he hated snakes. And one time the bucket got left in their house, and all the snakes got loose in their house. He was not happy. Yeah. But we would collect them, and so I wanted to show the kids there's nothing to worry about. This snake is just fine. It's just sunning itself. So I walk over, and it's a pretty good-sized garter snake, and I pick it up, and I say, see, kids, it's fine. And that thing whipped its head around and latched onto my finger, and all the kids are screaming. And I'm like, no, it's okay. And I went to shake it off, and then I have this snake hanging off my finger like this, and it's really comforting all the kids that this snake was not going to hurt them, right? And so finally I have to take him and I pull him off, him, her, I can't tell. Good thing I'm not a snake, right? And I pull it off, and I just throw him off in the grass, and then the blood starts rolling down my hand, and the kids were truly convinced that that snake was not going to hurt them. But I just thought of that story because of the way that, you know, when you live a treacherous life, sometimes it's going to whip around and it's going to bite you. And we saw that happen to Jacob last week. Jacob had gotten bitten because of his own treachery just like that. Well, you know what is really hard about it when that happens and your treachery comes back to bite you, or the recompense of your sin comes back to bite you? You know what is really hard about that? Is that you're usually not alone in paying the price. You're usually not alone in paying the price. We see that in so many stories in the Bible. Hopefully someday we'll get to do a study on the life of David. What an amazing story the life of David is. But we know that he had that moment of treachery where he took Bathsheba. You remember that? Another man's wife, not just another man, but a man who was part of his top guard. Somebody very loyal to him. And he took his wife and he had an affair with her, and she got pregnant. But you know, he didn't do all that alone. His servants were involved from the time that David was up on the roof, and he looked down there and he saw Bathsheba down there, and he thought, I'd like some of that. And so he talked to his servants and said, who is that woman? Right? He involved these other people who then had to keep his sin a secret. He involved even Joab, his military commander, because he had to cover up somehow. Now, this woman's pregnant. What am I going to do? I've got to cover this up. And so he sends a letter to Joab, his commander, who was at war and attacking a city. And he said, here's the plan. I want you to do this. Have everybody storm up to that city. But I want you to put Uriah, which was her husband's name, in the front. And as soon as they attack, everybody else pull back, but leave Uriah there, and he got killed. He involved Joab in his sin. Everybody got to pay the price. His family paid the price for what he did for years to come. So it's sad because we rarely sin in isolation, and we rarely pay the price for what we've done alone. We involve many people around us in what happens. Well, I think of it too in the news. We see some scandal, and there's usually a family who's attached to the person who's going to jail or whatever happened like that, and they're paying the price. Let me ask you this. Do you know who really paid the price for Laban's deception against Jacob that we learned about last week? You remember he worked the 7 years, and he was getting married, and on the wedding night, Laban switched the girls. Remember, do you know who really paid the price for that deception? Any ideas? Leah, yeah. Leah. Poor little Leah. It worked out great for Laban. He got another 7 years out of Jacob. Another 7 years of indentured servitude. Jacob got cheated, but he eventually got Rachel, right? Which is what he wanted, and he was okay with it because he said, it's just been like a couple days. I've served for 14 years for her, but it all went by just like a couple days. I'm so in love with her. But think of Leah, the poor girl. We talked about all of her qualities that made it so it would be hard for her to be married off, and everybody wanted Rachel. I think the Brady Bunch, Marsha. I'm sure she felt like, Rachel. That's all I hear, And so she grew up with all that, and now the night of Rachel's wedding comes, and Dad pulls Leah aside and says, this is what you're going to do. This is your chance to get a husband, and this is how we're going to do it. You put all these gowns on and stuff, and we're going to send you in the tent with the lights out, and you are going to get a husband out of this. Because he's thinking it's the only way he can marry her off. How do you think she felt? How did that make her feel that her dad would think this was the only way he could unload her on some poor, unsuspecting soul? We talked about Jacob's reaction in the morning last week. Can you imagine when you wake up and it's not the woman you thought you married? But think about this. How do you think Leah felt about that when she saw Jacob's reaction? What are you doing here? Well, I'm your wife. No. It'd be awful for Leah, right? Well, verse 31 in where we just read really sums up a lot of this for us. It says, when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened up her womb, but Rachel was barren. A lot of versions use a different word there instead of hated because it's used in the same sense when we talked about Jacob and Esau. And we went to the book of Romans and we went to the book of Malachi where God said, before they were even born, he said, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. And we talked about how the word hated is not always used with some kind of animosity towards somebody, but it means I have preferred and chosen this one and not you. And so some of the translations here in that very verse will say, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved. It means, in the original language, that Jacob had all his affection on Rachel the whole time. He did not have any affection for Leah. He didn't have any love for Leah. All he cared about was Rachel. So you can see how she would feel hated. And that's what she had to live with. He wanted Rachel. She was unloved. And that's bad enough, isn't it? Being hated and being unloved are not that much different. How horrible to be the unloved husband or wife of someone. You're married to them, but they really have nothing for you. They do not love you. Men, you might think porn is a harmless thing, but you know that's the exact message you send your wife when you do that. That there's someone else you'd rather be with. It may not even come out for years later. It may have been years and years ago that you did this, but you have something imprinted, ingrained on your mind, and there's some other woman you'd rather be with or you'd rather desire, and yet your wife then has to live with that. Of course, it's not always the men these days, is it? The world is changing. But that's generally the way that one goes. How How many husbands and wives have not been their spouse's only partner? Well, that's usually the way it is these days. And sometimes you have to wonder if you're the one they really want to be with. Right? Ladies, too, that guy at work, you say, there is nothing going on, and by that you pretty much mean sexually there is nothing going on. But I hear this term, I've heard this with all the young people I work with all the time. This is my work husband. This is my work wife. And it's like, what game are you playing here? It's dangerous territory. I used to work at one place down in Indianapolis, and it was really a Peyton's place because there were so many people that would come in to this company, and they'd be married to somebody, right? And they'd end up ditching the person they were married, and they would get together at this company, and then they would move in together, and they would get married and all this, and leave. It happened again and again and again there. I don't know why this was going on at that company, but it was. And you think of the poor spouse who is left out there. There's all this heartbreak and betrayal. And it's massively destructive, all of these behaviors, because someone in the relationship is just felt unloved. And you might as well be hated. That was Leah's life. And we didn't read the whole story because it goes on for a long time about this into the next chapter, but we just read those 5 verses. So you'll want to go back and read the others later. But when this happened, when this verse 31 that we just read, when this occurred, this all-out battle begins for the love of Jacob between these two women. These two sisters get into this just bloodbath over who Jacob is really going to love. Story reveals for us, for one, the problems of polygamy. And there are people now pushing for polygamy being okay, but there's people now just pushing you can be with as many partners as you want. It doesn't matter. Well, this here really shows the problems of polygamy, and it happens over and over again. People will argue with the Bible standards because there is polygamy in the Old Testament. But you have to understand this. Polygamy was not God's plan or will. When we started the book of Genesis, we saw what God's plan and will was. Do you remember what it was? One and one together for period. That's marriage. That is the only bounds for any sexual relationship between human beings. That is God's standard. He allowed people to... He allowed polygamy in the Old Testament, but he never sanctioned it. The first instance we have of polygamy in the Bible actually comes way back in chapter 4 of the book of Genesis. We kind of skipped over that one for the sake of time, but it was the grandson of Cain. Was Cain the good son or the bad son? Think hard. Yes, he was the bad son. He's the one that killed his brother, right? And Cain went on, and he lived this life separated from God and separated from his family. And it was his grandson who first brought polygamy into being. He was also the man, to show you the nature and character of the man who began this practice, who bragged about the fact that Cain killed one man, but I've killed 2. I am bad to the bone, was his song. And this is where polygamy comes in. It was never God's intention and never God's practice. You see many times throughout the Old Testament where polygamy comes up, but I can tell you this, if you read every single case, it will be laced with pain and struggle and jealousy, and that is exactly the case that Jacob finds himself in here. And this continual struggle between these 2 women, these 2 sisters who just want to be loved. And they go to great extents to try and win that love. If you were to keep on reading through the next chapter, you could see the continual contest between these 2 women for the affections of their husband. Leah was left feeling rejected and unwanted and unloved, while Rachel was cherished. But then something beautiful happened right there, that verse that we just read, verse 31. Looking at that again, it says, "Now the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren." So half of that is beautiful, half of it is not. But it is beautiful that the Lord saw Leah was unloved and he opened her womb. It sounds very familiar, this passage here. He saw Leah was unloved. It takes me back to when we were going through the life of Abraham and we saw Hagar found herself outside and looking inside once Sarah had had Isaac. And then she was to be cast aside after she had given Abraham a son. She was an outcast, unwanted, unloved, sent out into the desert with a little water and food and her son to die. And God heard the cries of Ishmael in the desert and rescued them. This sounds a lot like that because God is always looking. He is always watching. It says the Lord saw that Leah was unloved on the outside looking in. It doesn't even say that she cried out to him or prayed to him. It just says that he saw she was unloved and he acted on her behalf. We don't know how she handled her treatment with him. It doesn't really tell us much about that, but it does tell us that God was watching everything that transpired, and he saw her hurt, and he saw her tears, and he intervened in her life. And he gave her what? Children, a son to start. He gave her a son. Now here's the thing, thinking back through all the chapters we've gone through in the book of Genesis so far, why was it so significant that Leah had a son? The Redeemer. The promise of a Redeemer. Remember we talked about that? The promise. That is what everyone was looking for. That's why being barren was such a problem in the Old Testament, because every woman hoped that her son might somehow be the Redeemer, or at least might be the seed that would go on to the Redeemer. Everyone was looking for this all the way back to Adam, ever since God said that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. Not the one that bit my finger, probably should have, but the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. Everyone was looking that their son could possibly be that. And here she is, she's downcast and she's left out, and now she has a son. And think what that would mean to Jacob, because we saw 2 weeks ago when he was on the run that God came to him and he passed that promise specifically onto him. Jacob knew that he was the son of the promise, just like he knew that Isaac was the son of the promise, just like he knew that Abraham was the one to whom the promise was given. Now that promise had been given to Jacob and he has a son. Everything changes. And yet Rachel was barren. The apple of his life, the desire of his heart. She couldn't bring him a son. And it wasn't just, like I said, that Leah had a son, but very much so the fact that Rachel did not. Not only did Leah have a son, but she also had 4 of them. She gave the man a brood. 4 boys. I remember when we were talking about having one more and hoping for a daughter. And I remember I told Lisa, my brother has 4 girls, so we're likely to get 4 boys. I said, if we get 4 boys, we're done. Because we'll just keep having boys. But we got our little girl. Well, she gave him 4 boys. And I thought, honestly, she couldn't have been too unloved, because apparently Jacob kept coming back to the well for a drink. She kept having babies. But each time, this is so sad, each time she had one of these sons for him, all she could see was that maybe this time Jacob, her husband, would see her for who she really was and truly love her. If you read down, the names of the boys are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Those are the first 4 born. And if you go down to verse 32, when she had Reuben, this is what she said. This is sad. Listen to this. Hear her heart in this. Because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. That's what she named her son because of. All she was hoping was for what? One thing. Now my husband will love me. And then she has the second son. She has Simeon. And she says, verse 33, because the Lord has heard that I am hated. He has given me this son also. Do you see her constant, the cry of her heart? The third one, Levi, she says in verse 34, now, this time my husband will be attached to me because I have given him 3 sons. All she cares about is that her husband would love her. She's longing for love. Finally, on number 4, she says, this time I will praise the Lord. There's some kind of a transition that seems to have happened in there. But other than that, every time she was just met with disappointment. I give him a son. He's going to love me. He doesn't. I give him another son. He'll love me. He doesn't. I give him another son. He'll love me. He doesn't. And it just keeps going in this cycle. She's just longing to be loved by her husband. Because God saw Leah's sorrow and blessed her with these 4 sons, the competition reached a feverish pitch between her and her sister. Look at chapter 30, verse 1, where it picks up again. The story continues over the chapter line there. And this is what it says. When Rachel saw that she, that's Leah, herself, bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. Isn't that odd? She would envy the unloved one. And she said to Jacob, give me children or I shall what? Die. I'm going to die if you don't give me some children. Apparently, Jacob was somewhat pleased with these 4 fine sons of his, and Rachel caught on to this, and she came out swinging. She's like, if she keeps giving him children, I'm going to lose him. And she's getting desperate to have children so that she can have his affections. And she gets so desperate, she says to him, Jacob, if you don't give me a baby, I'm going to die. She seems to have completely forgotten how Jacob was just so smitten with her. And I believe she's overacting. Do you think she was really going to die if she didn't have a child? But it shows how much being a part of the promise meant to them. Everyone wanted to be in line for the coming Savior. Childbearing was very important to them. It was a part of their identity. It was and you see, whenever a woman was barren in the Old Testament, then it was a struggle. Our culture has changed so much now that people are not having children. We're not keeping up with the birth rate to keep the race going. I heard on the news this week that in Japan it's become a crisis because so many young people, they're not getting married, they're not having children, and the population is starting to go down instead of up. There's a certain birth rate that has to be upheld for the world to keep in motion. And even here in the United States, it is dropping. But in that culture, it was such an important thing to be able to have a child. Jacob's response in that I find somewhat surprising. It seems to show that the honeymoon was kind of over with them and that he was not pleased with Rachel's behavior at that point. If you look at verse 2, when she came to him and said, if you don't give me a baby, I'm going to die, it says Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. We never see that behavior between them before. He's just so head over heels in love with Rachel. She probably could do no wrong, but she crossed the line here. It says Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? That's fruit of the womb, not loom, okay? But do you see what he's saying there to her? Am I the one who's keeping you from having a baby? Why are you coming to me? Why are you getting on me for this? And he was angry with her. And he's saying to her, this is not my problem. We're having children over here. I am not the reason you're not having children, so don't take this out on me. So Rachel employed the same plan that Abraham did a while back, and she gave her servant Bilhah to Jacob as a wife, so she could claim that the children were born for Bilhah would be hers. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? We pass things down in our family trees. Some good, some bad. And this is what Grandpa Abraham did, remember? And Sarah was like, well, I can't have a baby, so I'll give her Hagar, my servant. Well, here we are years later, and Rachel is doing the very same thing. And she says, I can't have children, so I will give my husband Bilhah, my servant, and she will have children, and I will claim those as mine. I read this and I think surely Jacob knew the story of Hagar and Ishmael, his uncle, and the rivalry that existed between Isaac, his father, and between Ishmael. The rivalry that still goes on today. And he knew the stories from Grandpa Abraham, and he knew how it all played out and how far south it went, and yet he went along with it. And he took Bilhah in as a wife. Now he's got 3, and he begins to have children with her. Rachel's thinking here just exposes to me, though, how far people are willing to go to gain acceptance and love from someone. That she would actually take another woman and say, here, go have relationships with her so that you will love me. Do you see how twisted that is? You see it many times in the world where someone will sell themselves short or allow their own morals to be compromised or stoop to things that you would never think that they would do and they would have never thought themselves that they would do just to gain the acceptance of someone. He says to her, hey, baby, if you love me, you will, right? That's not love. That's abuse. I've known of cases of a woman allowing her husband to share their wedding bed with another woman, thinking that somehow her husband will accept her if she will go along with that. Isn't that horrible? It can go the other way, too. We saw it play out in a couple big-name celebrities, and I won't even say their names because that's not the point, but to where the wife had this open relationship and the husband was just supposed to accept it, even though he was a very wealthy and famous man himself, and he was just supposed to go along with his wife's open relationship, and it gave them all kinds of grief and exposure. It kind of exploded in the public, and I remember, this is the sad thing that I heard afterwards, that he grew up in a Christian home. And when he went to get counseling after this, the counselors told him, that's just your Puritan Christian roots, and you just need to get over that and be okay with this. While I know that most of the guys in the world are watching this guy, knowing that his wife was going around with all these other guys and it's supposed to be okay, and all the guys are looking around and saying, what are you doing, man? Why are you selling yourself so short? Why are you doing this? We see this happen in our society all over the place. How many young girls fall for, like I said, the guy who says, if you love me, you will. Then she's walking around with a baby, and where's he? Gone. I saw it in my high school. I went to an inner city high school, and a pretty rough place, and I don't remember why I was walking down the hall during class alone. I was probably on my way to the principal's office for something. I don't know, but walking down the hall, and there's this guy and this girl just screaming at each other in the hallway, and she's bawling and crying, and I just remember him turning to her and saying, you're the one that got pregnant, you take care of this. Well, it probably didn't start out with that kind of language, did it? Baby, I love you so much. And here it is. People sell themselves short trying to win a little love. Let me tell you this, and everybody tell your kids this too, if you have to win love that way, it's not love. And you hold to your guns. It's not love. And yet, we need and desire to be loved so much that we will do it to ourselves over and over and over again in life. So that's what she did. Bilhah gave Jacob 2 sons that Rachel claimed as hers, Dan and Naphtali. This apparently brought some of Rachel's charms back into Jacob's good graces, and Leah couldn't be outdone, but she had stopped getting pregnant, remember? She stopped having kids after 4, so she fired back by giving Jacob her servant Zilpah. Now he's got 4 wives. The man is in a mess. 4 wives. What Solomon did with 1,000? But she fired back, and she gave Zilpah, her servant, to him as a wife, so she could claim that the children Zilpah would have would be hers. Isn't this just twisted stuff? This is total Jerry Springer. Can you imagine what Thanksgiving dinner was like with this family? Here's an amazing, amazing thing about our God, though. This just blows my mind. God can redeem even this mess that they have created. God can redeem even this mess. We won't have time to turn over there, but you can write down Revelation 21, verse 12. Revelation 21, verse 12. Go back and read it, and you will see that is where the angel is showing John around heaven, and he brings him to the new city of Jerusalem. And there's this amazing thing. Altogether, they have 12 kids in this mixed-up Jerry Springer family. Well, when John gets up to heaven and he gets to see the new city of Jerusalem, he sees that there are 12 gates around the city. Not just one and not Peter sitting there. That's all fiction, right? Quizzes with Peter and all this kind of stuff. There are 12 gates around the new city, and above each gate is the name of the sons born in this dysfunctional family. Is that not mind-blowing? All the names we read in this passage are the names that are forever inscribed above the gates of heaven. Because God can redeem anything if we'll let him. Anything. Their names are inscribed in heaven forever. Now, that's not to say that what happened was good. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying anything goes and everything's okay. It was not good and it was not right what was going on, but what it is saying is this: God can redeem anything. Zilpah gave Jacob 2 sons. The names were Gad and Asher. Later on, through a little flirtation and finagling, Leah got another shot, and she gave Jacob another son named Issachar. She gave him one more son named Zebulun, and then she gave him his daughter, Dinah. All in all, 12 boys and 1 girl. Poor girl. But they were probably protective brothers. Well, if you read ahead, you will find out that the brothers of Dinah were very protective of her. We won't have time to go into that story, but they kind of wipe out a whole city for messing with her. Our boys were pretty protective of our daughter, too. But the intensity of this battle just continues in this strange contest for love and acceptance until finally, in chapter 30, verses 20 through to 24, it tells us this: then God remembered Rachel. Isn't that good? He helped out Leah when she was in trouble. Now he looks, and Rachel is in all this heartbreak and anguish. She is the one feeling unloved. And it says, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach, that whole stigma that she could not have children. And she called his name what? Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. We see here God is looking down on Rachel now, seeing her left out, and he lets her give Jacob a son of her own. The son comes with some foreshadowing, because as we move on, when we finish the life of Jacob, we will go into the life of Joseph. He's the next story that we'll be looking at, and a lot of what he goes through is because of the fact that he is the favorite son of the favorite wife. Jacob is just the favorite. The one you would think all good will come from. And so we will see how that unfolds in his life. Finally, though, we would have to jump ahead many years and 5 chapters to see it, but Rachel will actually give Jacob one more son while the whole family was moving home from where they are there from Haran to back to Canaan, where Isaac is. While they're moving back, she has one more child, but Rachel dies in childbirth on the road. That son would be named, any guesses? Anybody remember? Benjamin, there you go, and he is the last of the 12. And Jacob would bury her in a site that, believe it or not, this is one of the things I love about the Bible, that you can visit today. You can visit Rachel's tomb. Historians believe this is the spot where Jacob buried Rachel on the road home. Still protected. Here's the real point. We all want to be loved and cherished and accepted. We all do. For some people like Rachel, it just seems to happen. They have this charisma. They have something about them. They have this beauty, and everyone just gravitates toward them. And someone sees them and just flips for them. And they never have to look back, and they never have to worry about it. Ironically, often, as Rachel did, many of them end up worrying about it. Others, like Leah, seem to have everything going against them. Her looks were nothing. We talked about, we don't know where she's cross-eyed or what it was, but it's clear. It says, Leah was this, but Rachel was beautiful. So her looks were not working in her favor. Her father tricked a guy so that he could find her a husband, and then her husband is happy to throw himself into indentured servitude in order to get a different woman after they're married. How would that feel? She was pushing rope uphill the whole time she was trying to get love. What we see in this story is how God looks on and cares for and cares about the overlooked and the unloved. That is our God. If you read through the Old Testament, you will see over and over again where God speaks up for the widow and the orphan. We sang that in our first song this morning, didn't we? You make the orphan a son and daughter. Because God is always looking in on these. Several chapters ago, we saw that the young man, the young slave girl and her son, who were thrown out into the desert to wander and die, God was watching and He cared for them and He delivered them and made a nation out of that boy. Here we see Leah, as she said it to herself, a young wife, unloved or hated, depending on the translation you're reading. And God looks in on her and on her hurt, and He moves in a way that allows her to have a child. Not just one child, but 6 boys and 1 girl. She had the majority of the children of Israel. But God saw her sorrow and her rejection, and He acted on her behalf. Not only did God give her many children, the most children in this family, but He also gave her one in particular, and this is really important. We all know that the favorite son of Jacob would be who? We just said it, Joseph. Wouldn't he be the one you would expect to be the child of promise? And you see, as we look through his life, it's like he is such a good guy. You would have to expect he was the one through that the promise would come through. The Christ would come through him, and you know, that's not the way it happened. And he didn't come through the oldest. That would be the other one. You'd think he would have the birthright. Reuben, wouldn't that be the one the promise would come through? No. It was number 4. Somebody would probably slide through unknown and unheard of. He came through son number 4, the son named Judah, the son named Praise. Jesus Christ would come through that son of Leah. She was despised, she was rejected, but isn't that what it says about Jesus too? He was despised and rejected. There were no qualities of His face that would cause us to look on Him. Isaiah 53, you can read all that. 500 years before it happened, it told us that He would not be the loved one, He would not be the desired one, and yet He came through the one who would not be loved and would not be desired. The son of an unloved woman was the one who would bring the seed that would carry on to bring Christ in the world. But that is often how God works. It's like Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 through 29. You can turn over there if you want. It says, Paul writes this to the Corinthians, "For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even the things that are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God." It is like Jesus likes to slip in unnoticed through the door back to the left and come in behind everybody and quietly take His place in the world when no one is looking. He likes to use the overlooked and the unloved to do wonderful things. But though Leah had a life of rejection, the God of heaven who made the promise in the Garden of Eden looked down on this young woman, a woman with funny eyes, who no one wanted, and said, "I choose you. And through you, I will bring my son into this world, and I will keep my promise through you. Here's a truth we all need to grasp. No one is unloved or unwanted, no matter how things look on the outside. No one is unloved or unwanted. Not one. It's part of the crime that we abort how many every year? Of all the young girls and boys who think they don't measure up and think they can never be good enough, there is not one who God does not look down on and see their fate and feel their pain. Not one. Of all the people who are selling themselves short, like we talked about, to people who don't really love them, who think that they are doing, or what they are doing is the only way that they will ever be loved. I wish they could see how much their Heavenly Father loves them. If young ladies all over the country could just realize that one thing, it would probably end the porn industry and the prostitution industry in our country. If they just knew how valued they are in the eyes of God and how He looks on their life. I am sure the suicide rate in our world would plummet if people could just realize how loved they are by our Father who sees us all and loves us all. I'm sure our young generation who are always connected, who are never without their phones, 24/7 just plugged in and living with that because they have to be connected to people all the time. Their whole life is about how many likes they get on Facebook, which I know that's probably more like 40-year-old women with the likes because the kids have moved on to something else. But whatever platform they're using, their whole life is about how much they get viewed and how much they get seen and how much people will cheer them on. And yet, ironically, they have been diagnosed as the most lonely generation of all time that we know of. More connected than anybody else and more isolated. I heard on the news just this week that England has appointed a minister of loneliness. It is so epidemic because people don't know that our God in heaven looks down on them and sees their pain and sees their lives and sees that they are His creation and that they are loved beyond understanding. My question to you this morning is this: are you like Leah? Overlooked, unloved, forgotten? Maybe you feel that way, but the truth is you're not. You just feel that way. This God I talk about week after week after week is constantly reaching to you in His love, and He cherishes you. Don't look at things on the outside. Look on the inside. And I'm not being all Oprah here saying, look in yourself. No, look on the things all the things that He made in you and He sees in you. Look on the God who gave His Son to win you. And know how loved you are. One nice note to end on with the story of Leah. When Jacob came to the end of his life, at the very end of the book of Genesis, the very end of his life, while he's in Egypt with Joseph, spoiler, you'll have to get over it. At the very end of the whole book, he is getting ready to die, and he is talking to his sons, and he wants his body to be taken back from Egypt. Don't bury me here, he says. Take me home to Canaan. Take me home to my father Isaac's place. And actually, this is what he said. This one subtle thing, he says, take me back there. He says, there they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. That's good. They buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. That's good. And he says, and there I buried Leah. There is a fondness and a sentiment in his words that speaks volumes. While Rachel had his passion, his devotion, it's Leah who had a lifetime of love with him. And when it's time to go home, it was her name on his lips. She felt unloved, she felt forgotten. In the end, she was anything but. And so are you.